Welcome to Radical AI, a podcast about radical ideas, radical people, and radical stories at the intersection of ethics and artificial intelligence. We are your hosts, Dylan and Jess. Just as a reminder for all of our episodes, while we love interviewing people who fall far from the norm and interrogating radical ideas, we do not necessarily endorse the views of our guests on this show.
In this episode, we interviewed Dr. Lilly Irani, an associate professor of communication and science studies at the University of California, San Diego. She is a co-founder and maintainer of digital labor activism tool Turkopticon and author of the book Chasing Innovation: Making Entrepreneurial Citizens in Modern India. Dr. Irani's research broadly investigates the cultural politics of high-tech work practices with a focus on how actors produce innovation cultures.
Some of the questions that we explore in this interview include, when building and designing ethical AI systems, how can we make room for all of our emotions, including anger at injustice and hope for the future? What is Mechanical Turk, a tool that so many of us in the academy and industry use for our research, and how might it be exploiting labor? What is the intersection between labor justice movements and the AI technology industry? And what is the relationship between technology, power, and liberation? And how do we address this relationship through our design practices? It was a pleasure to speak with Dr. Lilly Irani, and we are so grateful not only for her coming on the show, but also for her mentorship as we continue to discern exactly what the future of this Radical AI project holds.
Well, first and foremost, Lilly, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for coming on to chat with us today.
Thank you for doing this. It's really great that we have a space to talk to each other.
Dylan and I are such big fans of your work, as are many other people in this community. But before we jump into your research, we actually want to start by asking you a question of what or why do you do the work that you do? And this is asking what motivates you, not just as a researcher, but also in life in general.
In terms of life in general, well, I used to joke that life in general, what motivated me was anger. I think for a lot of my career, it was seeing stuff that just pissed me off or seemed wrong. And of course, what pisses people off is really personal. Is really shaped by their histories. And then trying to do something about it. I think that there's so many things to be angry about that gets really exhausting and it can burn you out. So now I think about it not just in terms of like, well, here's something that I'm angry about, but what's something where, like, for the love of one another, we're going to fight to change this together because we need it to survive and have the world that we need. But that's all very abstract. I think a lot of the weird, I study innovation, and I critique it from like a labor perspective, from gender perspectives, and the Amazon Mechanical Turk projects that I do also come from this commitment to the fact that Mechanical Turk work is important and it's necessary, and people who do it, deserve just as much pay as anybody else. And I think for one of the places that comes from for me is kind of seeing my mom growing up. My parents are from Iran. They came over here after the revolution. My mom was a secretary in Iran. She didn't go to college. She worked at IBM. In the 70s, secretaries were learning how to program computers. So like my mom was basically a programmer in Iran as a secretary, someone without a ton of social status. And then we come over here and I'm growing up in the Bill Clinton's 90s, and it's all about computers are the future and programmers are amazing. And I'm like, wait, like my mom wasn't getting any of that credit. I don't understand. I was a computer science major in college. Like I was really into computers in the 90s, making web pages. And so I could kind of see the contrast. I could see that I was like being pulled into like struggling to be a woman in computer science and taking one for society in what was not really inviting culture. And then seeing that my mom, when she was doing the same work, she wasn't honored at all. So I think that's one place that some of my work comes from, and trying to figure out why I was being valued and my mom wasn't. It kind of opens you up to a lot of little mysteries about, well, what is skill? How is it valued? How is that shaped by gender, history, like geopolitical location, like, and how do we get recognition for what we do, even if it's not the things that people want to give us recognition for, like housework. All of that's those are some things that are in the mix for me.
I want to jump back to where you started this, which was about anger, and I think sometimes when we have these conversations about technology, ethics, and about justice, anger almost gets this like bad rap, or it's taboo in some way. Like we're trying to make the world a better place. We're trying to all come together. And certainly that's part of it, that community aspect. But I think this concept of like righteous anger is so important for motivating our way forward. And I'm wondering if you could talk more about that, about like, is there an appropriate amount of anger, or how do we use that emotion of anger in justice work in technology?
This is an amazing question, because this is I'm like, I don't know. Let's talk about it to figure it out. And that's maybe where the magic will be. Yeah, like I used to get so upset with kind of design thinking, moral injunctions to only have positive feelings, only have optimism. In a brainstorm, there are no bad ideas. Because like for me as a designer, I was like, wait, critiquing how this works is like one of the ways that I generate ideas. Like, why are you telling me the negative emotions are a problem? And of course, like Sarah Ahmed is this feminist philosopher, and she's written tons about the mandate to be happy, and how the person who names the problem in a room becomes the problem in the room. And a lot of people don't have the luxury of not being angry. Like Black feminists have taught us a lot about that, and what happens when, like say white feminists get uncomfortable with that anger. So there's a lot to be said for the value of anger. It's about being attached to there being something better. It's about kind of directing your energies at what needs to be changed. I think sometimes I get the sense that like people kind of like love a good rant because it kind of articulates something that they can't put their finger on, and like that's actually kind of empowering. It's like if you speak out, then you help other people speak out and find words for stuff, and other people do that for me. So that's all in the plus column. And but one of the things that was happening to me with COVID the first couple of weeks is it's like watching the news. I'm freaking out because like all this debate about like UBI, or are you gonna like means test, and are you gonna make people go to an office and fill out a form to prove that they need the money? And I was like the offices aren't gonna be able to handle that load, And so I was just, maybe it's not just anger, it's actually just being overwhelmed emotionally and not knowing how to proceed. And so I think one problem with like any kind of emotional overwhelm is if it kind of exhausts you, or if it keeps you from actually sustainably kind of pushing towards the things that need to change. With anger specifically, I think a lot of the times I was being angry because maybe I was coming out of like suburban upbringing and computer science life, is I didn't have a sense of like, you need to be angry with like other people so you can like work together and organize. Like I never learned anything about organizing. And so the anger wasn't maybe being matched with the kind of joy and hope that comes with working with other people. And then I guess sometimes what happens is when you're trying to get other people involved, like if they're kind of burned out on the negative emotions too, because they're dealing with a lot of stuff also, then having reasons to be excited about what you can do together and have it feel like the work is a good part of your day is important. And so something other than anger is necessary to like keep movements building. But there's a lot of people who know a lot more about this than I do. I just read Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Murray Brown. And when I first bought it, I'll be real, like, I was like learning about a lot about different kinds of labor organizing and community organizing, and I couldn't really relate to all the positive and healing and introspective work that book introduces. And after doing a lot of organizing work more over the last year since my book got done, and I wanted to turn my research into actual changes in the things that we study. After having that like lived experience of kind of getting much more deeply involved in the uncertainties of organizing and like the hope and exhaustion of like building lots of relationships and trying to like get us to do stuff together, then the book made a lot more sense. So I know that there's people who've been through this a lot longer and have a lot of amazing things to say. Maybe you can interview some of them too.
Jumping on a few phrases that you mentioned in your response there in terms of building movements, organizing, and change making, you do a lot of this in your work. I'm wondering what has motivated you to become this person in the way that you utilize your research and how you go about doing that.
I guess it kind of is when I first started doing research, when I was an undergrad, I started doing research because there was a problem that was, that felt bad for me and my friends. Like I was in computer science, there weren't a lot of women. I felt dumb a lot. And then I started talking to friends around my junior year and they were like, I feel dumb too. Wait, we all feel dumb, but like, we're not dumb. What? So we started this women in computer science group, but we didn't want it to be kind of like a corporate HR, recruiting women into jobs, but not actually changing the conditions of exclusion in computer science culture. We were finding the words for those things too. So that I did my undergrad honors thesis on like where women fell out of the CS pipeline at my school. So like research was always something that was meant to help organize in some sense, even if I didn't have the language. It was just like, we have a club, we're doing stuff. And then with grad school, when I started working on the Amazon Mechanical Turk stuff, I guess it was just I always grew up being the kind of kid who like participated in clubs or like knocked on doors for like getting out the vote or, delivering directories for fundraisers. And so I think I came out of that kind of more just community service mindset. And then as I tried to see changes in things like Turking wages with the Amazon Mechanical Turk work, I was realizing like, doing community service through software actually hasn't raised Turkers' minimum wages. Like Turkopticon, this project I've worked on for 10 years where workers can write reviews of their employers. Like, yeah, workers definitely make a little bit more money because they avoid requesters who have bad reputations for wage theft. But, we still have a set of laws that allow Turkers to get paid whatever rock bottom wage requesters want. And so I think like, I've actually only really started to learn about organizing and in some sense not doing community service or feminist software building, because I actually don't think like feminist software building is organizing. And I don't mean that as a slam on feminist software builders like me. It's just like we built the software, we maintained it for 10 years. It was, if you don't have a community that can bring labor and time and their relationships into helping maintain the software, bringing new people in, like getting money from the community to like help pay for servers, getting relationships, and so you can get people into a meeting to say how, can we change the root cause of this thing, like the law or the policy or Amazon's platform design, like. If you can't do all that other stuff, like our feminist software building was kind of like running on a treadmill, making things better a little bit in a really labor intensive way. Organizing is like pointing to the horizon and saying, what are the relationships and resources that we need to get towards that horizon? Not just what's the thing that I know how to do that I can kind of contribute and like hope somehow magically I get to that horizon with no broader strategy of other kinds of acts that I do with other people.
Yeah, I know for me, before I got back into academia, I had no idea what the Amazon Mechanical Turk was in the first place, and it might be the case for some of our listeners as well. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about just very basically what that system is and why it exists in the first place, and then maybe talk a little bit about the work that you're doing with Turkopticon and why it's so important.
So Amazon Mechanical Turk is kind of like Uber and Lyft for data processing, in the sense that it's a platform, it's a marketplace, it's a workplace where programmers or companies or academic researchers who they have a bunch of audio they need transcribed, or they have a stream of user-generated content, like pictures people are uploading to Facebook, and they need someone to look at it and be like, is this porn, is this not porn? Or they have like surveys or research experiments, like cognitive experiments, like for, like that stuff all goes into the Amazon Mechanical Turk platform. The people who need that work done, they can put a price per task, and then workers all over the world, but more than half of them are in the United States, can come and take those tasks and do them as a kind of cognitive piecework. So the reason why I say it's like Uber for data processing is that workers are positioned as independent contractors in Amazon's terms and conditions. Now, workers who are in California could be recognized as employees under the new law AB 5, but they would be employees of the requesters, the employers, the people who have the transcription task, for example. It's a little more confusing as to whether it's not Uber's not a perfect analogy. Amazon's not clear that they would be the employer in a lot of the cases. The workers have no minimum wage because they're independent contractors, and they, because they don't show up at a central workplace where they can actually talk to each other. It's like really hard for them to share information and engage in mutual aid or like get organized around things that they want to improve. And so the Turkopticon project started in 2009 out of a tactical media art project class, and I was asking workers, what do you like about this work? What don't you like about this work? And then I also asked, if you could have a Turker's Bill of Rights, what would it be? And a lot of workers said, like it's not fair that employers can just take our work and then decide whether it counts as good work or not, and then decide not to pay. Amazon gives the employer, the requester in that system, that right. So there's a lot of stuff they didn't agree on, but like that was one of the things they did agree on. So we built Turkopticon as a way of helping create a reputation for employers. Amazon's platform has a reputation system for workers, but not for employers. It really privileges the needs of the employers, because the employers are the ones who are using Amazon's web services, and that's a core business area for Amazon. If they can get workers to come work because the workers need the money, because they have a disability or they can't find another job where they live, because they need the extra money on top of their second or third job, the workers will come work for Amazon because they need it, and so Amazon privileges the people they're chasing, which are the employers.
And when I first heard about it, I actually heard of the Mechanical Turk as this kind of the paramount of innovation, right? As like this next step of how and this was a little while ago, right? So, and this, I can see your face right now, so this is different, but it's like, oh, okay, so now, people can control their own destiny, and it's a way for data to advance in that way. So that was the first argument that I heard kind of pro. And I know you do a lot of work in innovation, and I think this is a great kind of case study for what should we be thinking about, like innovation, and how does that relate to labor organizing?
Okay, gotcha. So like what does an innovation mean for labor organizing, and why did Mechanical Turk seem like magic to a lot of people? So yeah, when I found out about Mechanical Turk, it was because I knew people from when I was working before grad school. I worked at Google, and I knew people who'd worked at Yahoo and had search engine startups, and they were using Mechanical Turk to do kind of testing whether the algorithm is returning better search results, for example. And and also the field of HCI, people were saying like, this is going to enable whole new kinds of technologies that have humans in the loop, that kind of cover the ground that AI can't cover, and let us build bigger and more powerful information systems. I mean, there's like so many things about innovation that Mechanical Turk kind of lays bare, but if you kind of start going down the rabbit hole, like one is that artificial intelligence it is a name we have for algorithms that produce correlations or outputs given an input that seems sensible to human beings. Like something looks artificially intelligent if it responds to Justin Bieber by associating with pop star as opposed to person or something. Like something that's like culturally obvious to us. But culture always changes, language always changes, haircuts change, what clothes are cool change, slang changes. So artificial intelligence will always need a human layer of input to tell it, these are the correlations that are sort of culturally valid right now, to calibrate the AI to culture as it shifts. And that's what Amazon Mechanical Turk workers do. They basically automate culture by training algorithms to see it like they do. So, when we talk about programmers being the source of all of this amazing value that tech companies create by creating artificial intelligence, like those programmers, are getting massive amounts of help. Like without Amazon Mechanical Turk workers being there, like their AI would not look intelligent at all. Another thing that I've thought a lot about is how when programmers frame what they do as just an act of coding, that they get to look like, they're the ones innovating. But what we don't see under the hood is in systems like Amazon Mechanical Turk, workers are constantly trying to get in touch with employers, like programmers, and tell them, hey, like your task is designed wrong, or like, hey, this question that you're asking actually doesn't really make sense. They like give basically free management consulting to these requesters and help them work on their tasks if the requesters know how to listen. They don't get any credit for being part of the kind of process by which we kind of get new things. But also, like, I think with labor organizing, it's also, I think highlighting the ways that all kinds of workers are essential to the process of innovation is crucial because, listen, we all hear those stories about how programmers are more important than the rest of us. They're more important than teachers, so we can have automated teaching systems or MOOCs that like make platforms that, make individual teaching labor less arduous. Turkers hear those stories too, and so showing how all of our work matters, the communicative work, the non-automatable stuff, is the first way we're gonna have a chance of believing in ourselves enough to ask for what we deserve.
I want to latch on to a comment that you made about the computer scientists that are making these platforms like Mechanical Turk. Coming from computer science myself, this is a question that I ask a lot. How do you think that design decisions in technological systems play into societal harm and positions of power?
Wow. We were just talking about this in the design lab yesterday because at UCSD, because we're trying to create a curriculum for specialization. I think that we were talking about ethics, and we were talking about whether, we want to be teaching all designers about ethics or whether we want to teach them about marginalization and power. And I actually want to teach them about both, but I was starting to think about the difference between a designer and a doctor is that a doctor, sees a patient, talks to the patient, and has to make judgments about ethical ways to avoid harm, and make a judgment how to act in that moment. But a designer creates a system that's going to then be deployed in mass in some way. Like the history of the word designer is actually out of the Industrial Revolution. When artisans went to the factory, the artisan who used to be the designer and the maker laborer, and they could make the vase or the plate however they felt like in that time, became a kind of division between the designer who plans how the plate should look, and they tool up the assembly line to do that, and then the worker has to go to the assembly line and make the plate look how the designer makes it look, right? So designers make the rules and arrangements that can kind of scale out. And so in that sense, I think designers actually have the capacity to do huge amounts of harm. And UX designers get taught that our job is to advocate for the user. I was a UX designer at Google, but we get taught nothing about what happens when your advocacy for the user isn't getting anywhere in the organization. You don't learn about how power works in organizations. I didn't learn anything about how capitalism is, stock structures, like who owns the company, how they're trying to grow into new markets, like how all that's actually going to affect what kind of agency I have to advocate for the user. We didn't learn anything about how we, as being trained as professional designers, are being placed into a kind of privileged class position that makes a lot of the things that we even know, makes us unable to even ask a lot of the questions about what would cause harm to the users. Like, how do you check that kind of privilege? How do you create spaces where you not only listen but are accountable to ask new kinds of questions? And we need a kind of design where designers, we keep the kernel of what got us into design, which is we wanted to make technology and the companies that build them accountable to people at large. but we also need to learn the limits of doing that through kind of the professional expertise that is what counts as human-centered design now. Like, we need to learn to work with movements, work with organizers, amplify their efforts, use our ability to kind of imagine possible future configurations for technology to like help those movements like make demands on the technologies that they're, you know, trying to shape. We need to like disaggregate design and reaggregate it as something that's a better comrade.
I was recently, as in today, so I'm in my doctoral program, and one of the things that we're learning is how to teach ourselves. And so I was instructed as an assignment to make a teaching philosophy statement. And I started writing, and I came to this word liberation, and that being core to my teaching philosophy. And then my professor asked me to be more specific about what that meant. And I'm still in the process of rewriting that statement. But I'm wondering, for you and your teaching philosophy and your design philosophy, what role that concept liberation, or maybe another word that might resonate more with you, like power or something like that, what role does that play in design, or should that play?
Yeah, when you said, you know, I was asked to be more specific about liberation, and I'm still in the process of rewriting that statement. I feel like that actually is probably how I think about what fighting for liberation is. Liberation language is not a language I was familiar with, you know, coming through being computer science SoCal kid. It's a word that I've heard, you know, Black feminists use, activists use, and I guess maybe part of the magic of the word liberation is that it lets people define that for themselves, like what that kind of autonomy with their community would actually mean to them. And so liberation is not a thing. Liberation is a horizon to which we hold each other accountable in the work that we do and in the society that we're fighting for. And so I would say that if, you know, I would like to work towards a teaching philosophy and a design philosophy that figures out strategies for doing that when you're wrangling chairs in a classroom, you don't get to pick how big your class is, or when you're wrangling a bunch of code that's going to crash sometimes, and very few people know how to kind of change the code, because not everyone gets to learn how to code or gets those educational resources invested in them. So it'll look different. The tactics will look different, and I think that we have a lot of work to do in the kind of computing science design worlds of figuring out like what those tactics are, because like all of our tactics and methods, or so many of our tactics and methods that we learn institutionally, are coming out of how do we go become good employees for technology companies, but communities also build technologies. Like words, pencils, and silicon, they are all ways of doing things.
Yeah, this is definitely a relatively recurring theme. It's definitely in my research, but also in these interviews as we talk to people about AI and ethics. This notion of trying to incorporate things from the humanities and the social sciences into classrooms where people are learning computer science and design. And from your experience teaching, I'm curious what it's been like and what your experience has been trying to teach some of these concepts that are really important in design, such as liberation and power and the consequences of your design decisions, and what the response really has been from students who might come from a humanities background versus a technical background, and how you can deal with some of those potential mismatches.
So Christo Sims, who's in my department at UCSD, and I designed a class called Critical Design Practice, and we didn't want to have a class where students would come in and go try to save other people by doing good. And so the core task you have in that class is to choose an issue on the campus that affects you, and then, you know, choose one that your group is all kind of behind working on, and figure out how you're going to design something that intervenes in public understanding, awareness, interaction around that issue, and like gets you more allies. And so we actually teach some organizing tools, like the spectrum of allies, like how do you get someone from neutral to more on your side, or how do you activate someone to really like do something with you. We teach about kind of the ethics. Like we use the yes men and some of the work that they've done, and also some of the criticism that they get, to talk about the ethics of, when you're trying to do activism kind of on your own behalf, but you go in and start talking about other communities that you want to bring into the fold. Like, are you really accountable to those communities, or how do you make sure you're not doing harm to the people that you want to be in alliance with? And we tend to get like a subset of STEM students who've heard about this, and they kind of get the sense that something is off in the classes that they've had. Like, they have all these technical classes and it's not really speaking to them in some way. And so then they come to our class and they start to find some language for being able to contrast like what's missing in those other spaces. Because I had this experience too. It's like something is wrong, but I think it's probably like, but I couldn't put my finger on it in computer science and in HCI. So I was like, it's just me. Like, this research is not interesting enough. I haven't found the right topic. Like, I'm not reading the right thing. Like, I'm not, so we want to say it's not you. It's that these practices were not set up to actually allow you to have your full voice. The humanities, the more humanities students who come in, they often know how to build stuff in code, but they can use amazing tools on the web to build all kinds of stuff, like mock-up websites. Somebody made like an alternative Rate My Professor, where instead of rating how easy or hot your professor was, it would get people to reflect on classes 5 years down the line and say, what did you remember from this class? So you're kind of critiquing like how we think about your classroom. It's like one of my favorite projects. One group of students designed an alternative syllabus for our class. So they challenged our power as teachers. Students, have a lot more savvy than I do about how to make movies. And so we also open up design beyond the kind of computational bias we have. Like, we privilege, so like this is the stuff I research in my book, Chasing Innovations. Like, we privilege design as a field post sort of like 2004, because design is linked to creating intellectual property, and in particularly creating intellectual property in, in industries like tech, or industries that create like cultural products like Nike, where you want to create kind of copywritten content. That there's a lot of, but if you strip design away from this kind of brand or coding design thing, like, and it just becomes about making things that poke social interactions and provoke them in a different direction, then the humanities students have a lot to say. But it's been an interesting challenge because it's harder to find teaching materials that talk about design without kind of assuming it's about computation, or it's about making objects that somebody in a factory is going to make for you after you design it. So we use movies, we use activist projects as examples. We teach them how to think critically about the designed objects in their world, and we just let them take it from there.
For me, in my experience, coming from the humanities, one of the gifts that the humanities can bring is the transformative power of telling stories, and that being able to impact the world. And I know you, as an ethnographer and someone who uses ethnography, there's a lot of storytelling in that and in your research. And I'm actually wondering if there is a particular story, either from your research or from your life, that's on your heart right now in talking about these topics or more.
That's such a beautiful question. I think I was late to the transformative power of stories because in computer science, I so learned to privilege, pushing bits around to push the world around. But I kind of came to the power of stories through writing my book. Because one of the ways that I started to think about writing my book is I kind of worked harder and harder on like, why am I spending 10 years telling these stories? Am I telling them just to get tenure? No, like, I'm telling the stories in that book because I'm writing for people who are like the designer that I was when I was 24, 25, 26. And I had things that I thought were wrong in the world, and I wanted to kind of have agency to change it. And I was told that design was the language that I had to do that. And so each of my book chapters is organized around a story. So even if you don't care about academic theory, which like there's lots of reasons why a lot of people don't at different points in their life, I find it helpful sometimes. Like the story illustrates the problem. And so when you ask the story that's on my heart, the the story that I found myself telling a lot while I was working on my dissertation around, so my dissertation and the book are about designers in India who are trying to make the world a better place and kind of build up India by doing design and social entrepreneurship, because that's what they're told is the main way they should challenge their energies. It also so happens that by channeling their energies in that direction, they repeatedly over the years that I was working with them ended up applying their efforts to projects where, they would do field work. So in this one particular story, like they were doing field work in rural Andhra Pradesh or for a project around clean water. And they would go, 200 kilometers over several weeks, like getting up at 5 a.m., getting in the car, like bringing translators so that, because they speak Hindi or maybe different regional languages, but not the language that was spoken in Andhra. They're like working so hard to get people stories about what they need from clean water. And one of the things they hear over and over is we have too much fluoride in the water in this area. And it can cause fluorosis, which can cause paralysis. But to the funder and to the NGO that hired the studio, clean water just meant bacterial filtration, because that's what the World Health Organization prioritized, because that's what seemed like a global and scale enough problem. Fluorosis was seen as more as like a China-India problem. That's like a huge part of the world's population, but funder didn't prioritize it. And so then the designers were like, okay, well, everyone's asking us for a fluoride water filter, but the funder is dedicated to learning what they can to get these people to buy a bacterial water filter anyways, because in some sense, development rides on the assumption that at the end of the day, people have ideas about what they could want, but the funder knows what's the really important thing. And so you use people's ideas about what they want to make the appealing thing that still accomplishes like the Gates Foundation's goal. So that story haunted me, because when I started my dissertation, I didn't think it was going to be a big critique of innovation. I was just interested in how do you make design methods relevant to, work in India when they've come out of Europe and the US. And that was the post-colonial computing work that I had done. But that story kind of made me go, everything I learned in UX was a lie. Like that you're supposed to go out, you're supposed to listen to people, and then you're supposed to build the thing that the people are asking you to do, in a way that works for them. It's like, that is not what happened. And like, I have to embark now on understanding why that is not happening. So, one part of that story was about spending the next long while learning about kind of political science and anthropology to understand why that happened to me and what other designers need to know to understand why that stuff happens to them. One part of it was about like recognizing that like as a designer on that team and the other designers who were on that team, none of us asked, hey, okay, like, are there other movements in the area that are trying to work on this issue? Can we help them? Can we tell them about some of the stuff that we've learned in our ethnography? Mm-hmm. Can we go like tell journalists that we're hearing about this and we think it should be a story? Like, none of that even occurred to us because of, like I learned my civic education in the US, like get out the vote for who they tell you that you have the option of voting for and make the world a better place through tech. So in some ways, like the book became a way of amplifying the things that I had to learn to understand why this thing that really violated my hopes for design had happened. And then my hope was that people who read the book can kind of shortcut that process and not have to take 10 years to figure out why, So I ended up I'm hoping that the story is something that resonates not just with scholars of critical information studies, but also with actual designers who deal with this stuff in their daily life.
Yeah, thank you so much for that story. I can imagine myself there in that 5 a.m. setting in the morning.
Can I just add something super quickly to that? Like, I just want to like give credit to like the designers that I was working with. Like, they would stay up to like 5 a.m. sometimes talking about this stuff themselves, like ranting, being like, why is the funder being like this? So it's not like they don't notice and they don't care, but one of my friends who was at that studio, when she read my book, the history chapter, when she read like the history of how design's been set up kind of in general, but also in India, she was like, oh, I didn't actually know any of that history. Like that history kind of explains how like, it's not just about me like advocating to the client better. It's actually, about like a lot of the assumptions that are built into like how we do our work and who we do it with. And so I don't want to say like take credit like I saw something. It's just like I had like, okay, I'm going to put my time to helping out my fellow design coworkers by working on this part of the movement, which is like excavating why this crap keeps happening to us.
Definitely. Yeah. And it speaks to the like interdisciplinary nature of this kind of work so much too, like understanding the history and the cultural aspects and the social sciences, and then also the design aspects of everything. And I know your background is also very colorful and interdisciplinary: computer science and anthropology and a little bit of feminist studies and informatics. And something that we like to do on this show in a way to uplift and hopefully normalize greater diversity in this field is to ask you two questions, as the name of our show is Radical AI. We would love to know first what the word radical means to you, and how you might situate yourself and your work in that radical space.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, my first emotional reaction to the word radical was this little tinge of sadness, where radical to me sometimes means marginal. And when people use radical in the United States, they often use it as in a disparaging way, like, oh, that's too radical. Oh, that's a radical. And so I had this reaction where I was like, I don't identify as a radical. I identify as someone who wants to clearly identify the things that are actually happening in the world. And even if it involves being kind of collaborative, or if it involves being adversarial, I'm not okay with a world in which there's not room for all of us to thrive. And so that's kind of, if that's what being a radical means, then, I think all people should like radicals. So maybe in that sense, a radical is also a challenge to kind of think harder about, am I including everybody's liberation and the vision of liberation that I'm working for? And like, how can I challenge myself to do better about that? And so it can be something we can kind of also use to push ourselves to learn and listen to histories that don't tend to be given over to us by default.
One of the things that we've been talking about amongst ourselves and with guests is that there are actually a lot of people who, in these tech spaces, including yourself, who are working for liberation for all, or at least trying to navigate these spaces. And the question seems to be how we bring all these divergent paths that we're taking together into a singular movement. And we're drawing a lot from, community organizing and labor organizing as well, this concept of a movement and bringing us together from disparate places. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, do you have advice on how we might do that?
Do you think, so is the vision that you have about creating a movement around radical AI? Because when you said bringing us together in a singular movement, that kind of surprised me, because I don't think of myself as trying to create a singular movement. I think of myself as participating in different movements and then trying to think about what could be the connections and coalitions between those movements.
I think it's still very live. So even when I use that kind of terminology, it's still trying to actively define whether it is a single movement or multiple movements. And then again, that how are we even defining movement? Is that even the right language that we should be using for this?
I guess I think of the language thing as, does the language do something that's helpful for you at the time? And so I started thinking about, so when I was thinking about my research and the ways that academia tries to get us to make powerful brands and compete with each other and feel bad when somebody publishes something that you kind of wish that you'd written, I was like, this is actually really bad for making the kinds of changes we say that we want to see in the world. And so I was actually I was talking to some of my students and even just to myself, like, what does it look like if I treat research like a social movement instead? Or if I treat the people who are doing research around, say, labor as a social movement, then it's a high five if other people publish on stuff that resonates with the stuff that I'm publishing. We should be collaborating with each other to see, hey, can we organize ourselves better to be more useful to some of the communities that have stakes in the issues that we're writing about. It kind of changes, to think of ourselves as participating in a movement. It changes the actions that we take, and those are not often the actions that academic institutions want us to take. Like they want us to publish stuff, or sometimes they like community engaged work, but it's like the individual or a team that goes out and engages the community, as opposed to getting organized into something that's like already happening, changing your research agenda to be more relevant to a struggle that's currently unfolding. So in that sense, I do find movement to be helpful, because it, at least within academic research, it opens up the possibilities of what we do. But that doesn't really answer your question about like how do you do it. I don't, the way I always think about it is like start where you are. If you're like involved in something and you think that something that's happening is not right, then go find out who else agrees with you, and then talk about, okay, like I'll give an example. I mean, for like tech work, I'll give an example from Tech Worker Coalition. So like one of the things that Tech Worker Coalition does is like they'll host ethics lunches at the companies that they're in. There's a lot of debate as to whether ethics is a language that gets us to think more about individual judgment rather than social justice. But at the end of the day, like there's a lot of people in tech workplaces who think a lot about, am I being ethical right now? Because that's the language that they have to think about that dissonance between like their values and what it is they're being asked to do. And so if ethics is the language that gets them to the lunch table, then you can like work together to build out an analysis of like, well, why are we being forced to do stuff where it's dissonant with our values? And you can open up the conversation to some of the real causes of that. That's what the Google Maven people did. So I think you should use a language that brings people to the table, and then find the language that we need to actually see and work on the thing we're trying to change. And we start where we are, because where we are is where we're being asked to produce value, whether it's as renters or as workers or as teachers or as researchers, and push from there. Because that's where we have strong footing and like deep practical insight into like the mechanisms that we're trying to change.
There's clearly so much more we could talk about in this realm and in your research in general, but unfortunately we are out of time with this interview. So we just want to close by saying thank you so much again, Lilly, for coming on the show today.
Thank you for asking such interesting questions, and thanks for making a space where more of us can share knowledge with each other and find new questions and find better ways of working in movement.
We want to thank Dr. Lilly Irani again for joining us today for this wonderful conversation. And Dylan, what is your first initial reaction to this interview that we had?
For me, I think the most impactful moment was when we started talking about the power of stories and the transformative power of stories specifically. And that's something for me, right? I know I play the minister card all the time, but it's something for me that's really important, because I truly believe that telling stories is how we change the world and how we change lives. And some of the stories that Dr. Irani shared with us, especially from her own background, were they were really inspirational to me. Was there a particular part of Dr. Irani's story that resonated with you, Jess?
Yes, all of it. I was just really excited to hear that so much of her history and background played into her motivation for the research that she does, especially two things in particular that really stood out to me. The first one was the fact that her mom was also a computer scientist, but wasn't being valued in the same way that she as a computer scientist in the US was versus in Iran. And then also the fact that she was seeing in her computer science classroom in college that women needed a group. And so she wanted to create that group, and that sort of propelled her interest in this change-making space. And I think both of those seem to play really deeply into a lot of the work that she does. It was just really, it's great to know someone for their research, but it's almost better to get a deeper sense of who they are as a person and what drives that research too, you know?
I like what you said about the change-making space too, because I feel like that's a lot of what we spent this interview talking about was that concept of change making and how we do it and what impedes it. And then this concept of innovation, which is something that Lilly spent a lot of time on, even, in her book, which is called Chasing Innovation. And this term innovation is something that I've been trying to think a lot about, and I don't always know what to do with, like similar to that word liberation, which we talked about and did some definition exploration during the interview. But this concept of innovation and what are the limits of innovation? When does innovation get in its own way? Is everyone using the same word, like the same meaning behind it when they say the word innovation? Is it always like unbridled capitalism, or can there be intentional innovation? There was this very particular quote that I wanted to pull out from our interview where Lilly said, "Words, pencils, and silicon, they are all ways of doing things." And for me, that was such a gut punch almost of the ways that I might value certain forms of innovation. Maybe certain shiny forms of innovation, the smaller the chip, right? Or the faster the processor, or, Elon Musk going to space, right? All of these things I'm like, oh, that's cool. That's cool. But is it really getting to the heart of this, liberative message? Is it really getting to the heart of the problems that we're trying to solve in community, or is it distracting and getting in the way?
And it's interesting, too, talking about these ideas and something that we were asking Lilly about. Yes, it's important to bring these ideas up and to think through the relationship between liberation and power and technology and design. But then if we as, HCI researchers and PhD students are thinking about it, how do we get everyone thinking about it, everyone in this space, in the technology space, in computer sciences and design? And I'm just still so curious about that. I don't think there's a one off answer to this question yet, but hopefully we're slowly trying to build our way towards that solution.
I think that part of our way towards that solution is laying bare or laying more transparent these systems of production that we talked about with Lilly, especially with the work that she's doing with Turkopticon, and looking specifically at the Mechanical Turk project, because what Lilly's asking us to do is to ask, who gets credit for the work that's really being done, and let's really shine a light on the companies that are doing this exploitative work, really for profit margins. Right? And let's try to build a better system that allows people to really get credit for the work that they are doing in a way that's equitable.
Yeah, and all of this really just brings to light this idea that design is super powerful, and that power can be great, it can be dangerous, it can be harmful, it can be so many things. And this was actually another thing that I was feeling immediately during and after the interview. A sense of empowerment, which can be both good and bad, coming from a computer science perspective and background, and also a little bit of design as well. I feel a lot of privilege as a computer scientist, and I also feel really powerful. I think that the ability to code and design and make tools, even ones like Mechanical Turk, that is such a powerful skill to have. And that can be obviously used in very, very harmful ways. But if we give the right tools to computer scientists and to designers and to thinkers and educators, then maybe we can turn that potentially harmful future into empowerment, in the sense that these people have the ability to make positive change.
So what you're saying, Jess, is that really this is all just Spider-Man, right? This is all just with great power comes great responsibility. So really, instead of these interviews...
Was that Spider-Man or was that Churchill?
That was absolutely Spider-Man.
One of them might have been said before.
No, I don't think so. I think that was absolutely Spider-Man. Which I think is the right place to end this particular episode of the Radical AI podcast. Is with maybe one day we'll get a chance to interview Spider-Man. But again, we want to thank Dr. Lilly Irani for joining us today on this episode. And For more information on today's show, please visit the episode page at radicalai.org.
If you enjoyed this episode, we invite you to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or your favorite podcatcher. Join our conversation on Twitter at RadicalAIPod. And, as always, stay radical.
Like spiders.
Churchill definitely said it first.
I don't think so. It's absolutely bad. Okay.